Okay, so thank you everyone for coming back, and we're just getting ready for the last panel discussion of the afternoon. I'd like to hand over now to Dr. Paul Mullen from the National Lottery Heritage Fund.
Thanks very much, Niall. Delighted to have been asked to come along today. As Niall mentioned, I'm the director of the National Lottery Heritage Fund, and we'd be a sort of major funder of heritage projects of all types throughout the UK, and my job is basically looking after things in Northern Ireland. But I also chair what we call the Decade of Centenaries Roundtable in Northern Ireland, and one of the challenges that we'd recognised well over a decade ago was that with when we were in 2010, 2011, the kind of oncoming decade was something of centenaries was something that caused a degree of disquiet, given how the past resonates in a Northern Ireland context, and that's where it makes me just briefly reflect on something William was talking about, and that was the whole kind of issue of commemoration as being more than just history. And there's an interesting debate that goes on at times between anthropologists and historians as to really, is commemoration at all about history, or is it all about the present? And that's the context, particularly in Northern Ireland, where commemoration is something that can be quite challenging to deal with because it's seen in very different terms. It's one person's celebration is another person's horrific story about the past. So the sensitivity that's required to it. And it reminds me, back in 2016, I had a conversation with Maurice Manning, one of the co-chairs of the Taoiseach's Historical Advisory Group. And we were talking about 1916 in Dublin and whatever, and he saw it purely in historic terms. And I think by the end of the conversation that I had with him, he did accept that the lived memory and the lived experience goes beyond simply a generational one, or goes through generations, and that is certainly true in Northern Ireland. And then that links us back to obviously the Troubles, and we've gone past the Decade of Centenaries, moving into other forms of remembrance about historical events which still have a tremendous impact on us today. But anyway, that to me is the context, I suppose, for some of what we've been about today, and this session will look at sort of photography and cultural identity. But I'll have the opportunity of summing up the day at the end of this session, and with some of my broader reflections on it. So firstly, I'd like to introduce Dr. Erika Hanna, who is a social historian with research interests in place, visuality, and the built environment in Ireland and Britain. She's published 2 books on modern Irish social history: Snapshot Stories, Visuality, Photography, and The Social History of Ireland, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2020. Through examining a wide corpus of photographic materials and practices, from photo albums to studio portraits, community photography and documentary photography, it examines how ordinary Irish people used photography in order to make sense of their lives and contest authority and injustice, and explore what using photographs can tell us about the nature of social history. She joined the University of Bristol as lecturer in history in 2015. Prior to that, she was the Chancellor's Fellow in History at the University of Edinburgh, and Leverhulme Early Career Fellow at the Centre for Urban History at the University of Leicester. She sits on the committee of the Urban History Group and is social media editor of her Urban History and the executive committee on the executive committee of the British Association of Irish Studies. So I will pass you over to her now.
Hi, can you all hear me okay? Thanks very much. This is my first ever attempt to give a paper while also looking after a baby. So we'll see how that goes. I'm sorry if you hear her. So I was asked by Tanya and Trish to talk about photography in the Troubles, which is in many ways, as we know, is well-trodden ground. But a lot of what I have to say ties in with themes we've talked about so far, to do with the ethics of seeing and the problems of power and justice and the image. So I'm going to talk today about photography and the Widgery report and Bloody Sunday, and how questions that emerge from that really force us to interrogate the role, the responsibilities of the photographer. So we all know what the Troubles looked like, a repeating visual cacophony of mid-air bricks, hailstorms of glass, and men in running battles on the streets under an ashen sky. These black and white images appeared repeatedly across the global media throughout the 70s and 80s and played a crucial role in shaping the international visual economy of the conflict. These images, as we are all well aware, raised a series of problems for the photographer and for those who've interpreted them since. Where and how should a photographer point their camera in moments of crisis and violence? Can the photographer's ability to document provide a route to justice? And crucially, how should we respond to the suffering of others? So these tensions between the effective, activist, and empirical aspects of photography were in evidence on the 30th of January 1972 as this anti-internment march made its way round Derry. So from his home in the Rossville Flats, Derek Tucker photographed the crowd assembling below on a point-and-click camera usually reserved for days at the beach. And in many ways, this is an interesting photograph, as it has the patina of that period's Kodachrome images of early color, that early mass market color photography. In most of the photographs we see of Bloody Sunday tend to be black and white. So it forces us to think about how the Troubles is represented through particular genres. But soon the calm atmosphere recorded by Tucker was disrupted, and by the end of the day, 13 men had been shot dead by the soldiers of one para, and a 14th lay fatally wounded. And the images of this day are well known and have become part of the established genealogy of 20th century Ireland. Here are some images taken by Gil Perez of the day as it unfolded. But as the day descended into violence and people began to be shot at, the photographer's instinct was to turn and to photograph people as they lay dying. On that day, Fulvio Grimaldi took what are now well-known photographs of Jackie Duddy as he was carried through the street wounded. Gil Perez recorded Patrick Doherty's last moments in a series of 4 photographs as he attempted to crawl for safety under a wall bearing the slogan, "Join your local IRA unit." Hugh Gilmore was shot dead as he ran away from soldiers in Rossville Street. The moments after he was wounded were captured by Robert White. Michael Kelly, John Young, Michael McDade, and William Nash all died in Rossville Street. Kelly was hit first. His body was photographed by the barricade by Robert White, a freelance photographer from Derry. So these photographs attempted to focus on the emotive power of death and victimhood as part of an activist practice which aimed to bear witness of these fleeting and frenzied moments. However, this is not how the photographs were used. At a subsequent tribunal, Lord Widgery's primary aim in examining these images was to find validation for his contention that those who'd been shot had been handling or could have been thought to have handled firearms. The tribunal repeatedly sought weapons in the photographs presented before them. When this well-known photograph of Michael Kelly, John Young, Michael McDade of the barricade was examined, the emphasis was repeatedly put on the nature of the object in the man on the right hand. And this particular image is interesting because it comes from the Home Office files on Bloody Sunday, and so still bears Widgery's marks, where he attempts to identify people in the image. And although obviously what what Robert Weiss is doing when he takes this image is attempting to record this moment of suffering and in the streets of Derry, when Widgery examines this image, the focus for him is on the hands here. Repeatedly he asks people, like, what could this be in this young man's hands? And what they do is they pass around the course an image of this photograph, not a good image of this photograph, but an image of this photograph taken from the Sunday Independent, the week after the events of Bloody Sunday. And they use the poor quality of the newsprint of the image almost as a way of giving materiality to the frenzied and confused conditions that the soldiers faced on Bloody Sunday. So they repeatedly ask witnesses, is it legitimate that in these conditions this would have been interpreted as a nail bomb? So what's understood to be a rock and was constantly understood to be a boy throwing stones is pushed at repeatedly by Widgery. The boundaries of the shape are repeatedly interrogated to be so that Widgery sort of pushes at the logic of what this image is, asking people if they can instead see a nail bomb. And this interrogation of the photograph to repeatedly look for weapons in the hands of those who died is repeated time and time again over the period of the Widgery Tribunal. So when images of Jackie Duddy lying dead in a car park were examined by the tribunal, the emphasis isn't on this image of victimhood, but it's instead on the people around Duddy and whether or not any of these people in the background of the shots could legitimately be thought of to be holding firearms. And Widgery repeatedly sort of plays on this tension between the blurriness of many of the photographic images and the confusion of these moments of violence, to ask, in a moment of panic and confusion, that could have been a nail bomb, that could have been a gun. So similarly, sorry, I just have a child shouting here. Similarly, when the images of Paris, when Gilles Perez's images of Patrick Doherty are examined by the Council for the Tribunal, the fact that Patrick Doherty's hands are in different places in different images is used as a way of thinking whether or not someone's run into the photographic frame, removed a firearm, and run out between these images. And this is sort of speculated on by Widgery and his team. So what we see and time again in these images is the way that Widgery and his team of barristers push against the most obvious meaning of the photographs and seek instead the slightest visual evidence for their own narrative of events. In photographs which use tropes of war and suffering to foreground the victimhood of the boxhiders, they instead search irregular patches of light and shade on the edges or in the background of images to assemble plausible weapons in these images. And indeed, importantly, Widgery exploits the tension between the perceived objectivity of the photographic evidence and its implicit ambiguities of meaning in order to imply the guilt of the deceased. So an examination of how photographs were used at the Widgery Tribunal allows us to explore questions surrounding the ethics of seeing in a moment of violence and an era of fast shutter speeds. The tribunal shows how photographers negotiated their equivocal role as bystander and participant, and the way they attempted to use photography to campaign for the rights of those within the frame. But reflecting the ambivalence of Seamus Heaney's dictum that there's no such thing as innocent bystanding, these photographers attempted to intercede on behalf of others with their images inflected by an uneasy combination of sympathy and anger. But But in the minutes of the tribunal, we see how the impact of the image was never quite what photographers hoped or expected. The tendency of photography to decontextualize, to isolate events from longer histories, was exploited by Widgery in order to focus on the short moments of shooting and to pull events away from longer histories of state policy in the province. The emotive framing of victimhood by professional photographers unintentionally contributed to a process where the focus of the tribunal turned on the actions of the dead rather than on the army. And again, we see this, these sort of activist documentary photographers who are largely coming from the left and part of an international movement of documentary photographers in this period of the late 60s, early 70s. They really see themselves as part of the activist crowd. They see themselves as part of the crowd or the march on Bloody Sunday. But their focus really is on people marching in the crowd rather than the actions of the army. And then, so this sort of photographic sympathy means that these photographs are turned on their head to interrogate the actions. It becomes part of a process of interrogating the actions of the victims rather than the actions of the army. So time and again, Widgery exploited culturally specific notions of photographic truth to shut down debate about what photographs presented. However, even as he did this, he exploited the malleability of light and shade in the images placed before the tribunal to build a case of those who the guilt of those who died. Indeed, the photograph became one of a range of documents which enabled the final report to deal only with the circumstances around which people died under the heading were the deceased carrying firearms or bombs. So this year marks the 50 years since Bloody Sunday, and in the intervening decades, photography has taken on a new role in empowering survivors and making sense of memories of those events. The image of Father Daly leading Dudley's wounded body through gunfire now stands larger than life on the end of a terrace wall in the Bogside. It was painted by a local artistic collective, the Bogside Artists, who attempt to produce work which in their own words is commemorative, and so being is also curative. And that link between commemoration and the curative potential of the arts is really interesting in this moment of the Decade of Centenaries. The feminist photographer Joanne O'Brien photographed family members of the deceased on the spot where their relatives died, asking them to bear witness to what had happened to them and to their family. These portraits attempt to reframe Bloody Sunday, not as the events of 27 minutes or an afternoon, but rather attempted to bear witness to the grueling decades of campaign, which had fundamentally changed the lives of those in the community. So again this year, marchers walked through Derry holding banners aloft painted with the faces of the dead. These close-cropped images, which have become central to the way that Bloody Sunday is envisaged and remembered by the community in the Bogside, have now taken on a talismanic importance for those who've lived through and lived with the events of January 1972. So fluttering in the cold January wind against Derry skies, they're a reminder of the youth of those who died, and in the emotional expression visible in their enlarged portraits, that these lives cannot be reduced to the events of the day they died. So thanks very much. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Erica. Indeed. Any questions for Erica? Well, if there's no immediate questions, we can ask some questions at the end, and maybe we move on to our next speaker, Pauline Vermeer. Pauline is a French photography curator and historian based in New York. She was formerly the cultural director of Magnum Photos New York and a curator at the International Center of Photography and the Museum of Modern Art. From 2002 to 2009, she worked at the Henri Cartier-Bresson Foundation in Paris, and she is the author of numerous interviews and essays on photography. and she sits on the boards of the Saul Leiter Foundation and the Catherine Leroy Fund. Polly.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Erika. I don't know if Erika is still here, but thank you for the presentation and for highlighting the role of photographers in times of troubles. And Gilles Perez's case is very interesting indeed. And maybe we can all talk about this later. Hopefully, Erika will be back with us. I want to thank Trish, particularly for giving me this opportunity to talk about those women photographers today. And I'm speaking obviously as an outsider, as a French person living in America. I'm a photography historian, and this is my perspective on this work. I've been researching the subject of photographic representation of Northern Ireland since 1969 for 20 years. And I'm really grateful to the photographers that I'm going to be talking about here, who've all been incredibly generous in their time, incredibly enthusiastic about this project, and so glad that their work can be seen here in Ireland years later. So the Troubles were extensively documented by Irish as well as foreign photographers, some of the greatest of their time. Looking into this expansive visual archive, one cannot help but notice the overwhelming absence of women photographers. Yet quite a few came to Ireland between the 70s and the 90s, all of whom made extraordinary work and cared deeply about the subject. While some of these photographs were published and exhibited at the time, they are seldom included in the visual representation of that period today. There is a crucial gap in the historiography of the time. Acknowledging this gap in the history of representation, the Gallery of Photography wished to present their work in the exhibition that you will all hopefully see later today. Indeed, their perspectives provide a vital addition to the history of photography as well as to the history of Ireland. So I produced, Trish asked me to include the work in the show, protest show, and so I thought that maybe a video projection might be the best way to gather them on this occasion, and these are the photos that you'll see in the show later. And so they're chronological, I organized them chronologically, so all of them range from the 70s to the 90s. So I start with Christine Spengler. Christine Spengler is a renowned French war photographer. Since 1970, she has photographed and reported on conflicts, primarily from the point of view of the victims of war. She worked freelance as a photographer for SIPA Press, Corgis, Sigma, and AP, where she documented wars in many countries. In the early 70s, she comes to Northern Ireland for the first time, and this is a photograph that she takes. In fact, this is the first photograph that she took when she arrived in Belfast in '72 of British soldiers frisking kids who are having a blast. And this was quite, at the time, this photo was quite seen and traveled in the press. Clearly, Christine Leroy was really interested in children, and you'll see that really they are the main focus of her work in Ireland. This is an interesting one. Elvis Presley had just passed away a few years earlier, and those girls are performing in front of him. So Christine Spengler was really particularly drawn to daily life and to children, as she says, looking for love and resistance amidst the conflict. Her photographs were seen at the time, but have still, at this point, have not made it into history books, or they are seldom seen when looking into the representation of Northern Ireland. This one is particularly striking, of this little girl holding that flag. And when she talks about this photo, she was speaking about this photograph on a French radio a couple of years ago. She had a retrospective at the Maison Européenne de la Photographie, and she was saying that she is deeply inspired by Goya and the disasters of war, and that somehow seeing that little girl, that's what resonated with her. Catherine Leroy, another French photographer, passed away in 2006. She was a renowned French war photographer. In '66, age only 21 years old, she left France to cover the Vietnam War. A self-taught photographer, as was Christine Spengler, She became the first woman and non-military photographer to parachute into combat with the US Marines. When captured by North Vietnamese forces, she turned her experience into a cover story for Life magazine. She came to Northern Ireland in '79. She might have been here in '72, but her archive has yet not been looked into. In fact, I was very privileged. I sit on the board of the Catherine Leroy Foundation, and I asked to see what she'd done in Ireland, and so these have never been seen before. And there are more, and hopefully some of you will want to go look into that archive that's in France. And what's interesting with Catherine Leroy is that she really was a war photographer, and so she treats the subject very much like a war photographer. And so one thing that I was speaking about with Sinead this morning about how it's difficult to talk about women in general, because of course none of these women photographers had the same styles, the same vantage point, the same experience in life, and different styles indeed. And in the case of Catherine Leroy, in fact, she would define herself as androgynous, as many women war photographers. They're not taking photos as women, but as photographers. And as many photographers at the time, she would go and try to document as much, as many of the communities, as many people as she could, including this photograph of a soldier, which I think strikes me. You don't often see photos of the intimacy of the British soldiers are generally in their outfits outside, generally next to a child. I mean, there was this sort of the stereotypes that started becoming too much of a, you saw them so much, but I think this photograph is really different, and I think that's probably because of her experience with the Marines in Vietnam, that she had that sort of almost feeling a kinship with young soldiers whose age she was also. Christine Harzal is a very interesting photographer, British photographer, whose work I ran into. I discovered looking into old issues of camera work. She came to, she's originally from Lancashire, sorry, I'm not pronouncing this well. She's based in London. She trained as a fine artist. She taught in various art colleges until the mid-70s, when Bloody Sunday motivated political engagement. Walking away from her career on the staff of the Slade School of Art, she embarked on a 40-year mission to campaign for social justice and political action through political art. She co-founded the Poster Film Collective, which produced hundreds of internationally distributed political posters over 2 decades. She was primarily involved in supporting the struggle in Belfast through posters and as a photographer, where she attempted to act as a witness/observer, using documentary photography to support the struggle against British imperialism. She also worked on several films, including directing a film for Channel 4, and has recently produced a book about the Poster Collective that's called Art as a Mass Political Weapon. And so when I reached out to Christine Harzal, she was really, I think, surprised, because this is work that she's done so long ago, and she, I think, was really touched and moved that her work would be shown here in the context of this show. And it's interesting because she's not, like Catherine Leroy or Christine Spengler, a professional photographer. In that sense, she was using photography for activism, for a social means. This one is called and all the captions. I'm sorry, I'm going fast because I have 15 minutes, but you'll see all the captions in the show. They're all there. But this one's called The Great Escape. And some of them became posters that were used, and I'm going to go to them now. Yeah, sorry, I'll go back to this one. So, for instance, this photograph is a little blurry. It's not your typical representation, and it was used as a poster. You'll see, but I wanted you to have that. I thought this quote, that was an interview for Camera Work in '81, that I thought was really interesting. That is questioning the place of the photographer in the lives of those who are represented. And I think this is a struggle for all the photographers, or many of the photographers who've been placed in that situation of witnessing the life of others. And this is, I feel, like a common thread in all the conversations today. Who are you taking photos of, and why, and for whom? And I feel like really in this interview, she was really, this is what she was going for and ending with, it is vital that the people who are part of any struggle should have the means to represent themselves, is interesting because really 81 and the death of Bobby Sands is when Northern Irish photographers start really taking the narrative back, I would say, meaning that enough with the foreign photojournalists who come and cover our story, we can do this ourselves. And I think this was the impetus in Camera Work, which was a British, an English magazine, Marxist, really wanted to push that agenda with community photography and the opening of Camera Work in Derry, but Trish Joseph. So that was an interesting moment also for photography, saying, you know, we can't document the lives of others forever, you know, they have to be representing themselves. And if we can't be othering, then what can we do with our own images? So that's an example of those posters, of the poster collective. And what's interesting with the women photographers' work is that you start, you know, the work appears, you can see the female as subject as well, appearing very clearly in the photographs of those women photographers. Not to say again that the women only took photos of women, etc. But you can see, knowing, of course, that it's a woman, like in this case, for instance, the central subject being that woman in the crowd, knowing that a woman took this photograph somehow, in my view, changes a little bit the narrative of the photograph itself. So this is Paula Allen, who's American. She's a photographer, lecturer, and social justice activist. She has worked for human rights organizations such as Amnesty International, V-Day, the global movement to stop violence against women and girls, and Refugees International in countries such as Afghanistan, Haiti, North America, Iraq, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Her images have been used in numerous mediums such as magazine, books, documentary films, international human rights campaigns, university presentations, museum exhibitions, and postage stamps. Her book Flores en el Desierto, Flower in the Desert, tells the story of women searching in the Atacama Desert in northern Chile for 17 years, looking for the remains of their disappeared loved ones. She has received many grants and others, including a Pulitzer Foundation grant and an Amnesty International Award for Humanitarianism. And so what's interesting also in Paula Allen's work is that you can see that she goes, this is not photojournalism anymore. This is trying to go deeper and to really collaborate with the subjects. And I think this is interesting. This is what she has to say about the photo you just saw. This photograph of a mother and a child. Because of course the context, not only the context of the story, but the relationship between the photographer and the subject can be really, really important. And for photographer to understand the story too, and the story of the lives that they are documenting. And here again, the mother, the woman as the central subject of her photograph. Donna de Cesare, American also. She's an author, documentary photographer, educator, known for her groundbreaking coverage of the spread of US gangs in Central America. Her photographs and testimonies for children in Guatemala and Colombia who are former child soldiers, survivors of abuse, or the stigma of HIV have assisted UNICEF in developing protocols for photographing children at risk. She's an associate professor of journalism at the University of Texas in Austin. She's a consultant to the DART Center for Journalism and Trauma at Columbia University, and she's a master teacher with the Gabriela Garcia Marquez Foundation for Latin American Journalism. De Cesare has an Italian name, but she's of Irish descent, and she was really interested in the 80s she wanted to go to Ireland to document the social justice movement as well as the Troubles. And she would go every year. For a few months, she went to work on stories, different stories. This is in Portadown in 1986. As she explained, she saw herself as a witness, but with a mission, she was trying to understand. And in fact, Donna is hoping, and I think she will come to Dublin in May to talk about her work. She's been hoping to come back for many years, and she was really pleased, particularly present in the conversations we had with Trish about this project. Her work appeared, in fact, she's the one who was the most seen at the time she did her work. She was included in a show in New York called Terrible Beauty at the Gallery Space in New York. And her work was included in an Aperture, a special edition of the magazine Aperture that, in fact, Tanya wrote a beautiful piece in at the time. That was 94, Tanya Kiang. And her work was included, but she was one of the few female photographers at the time. The reality is that there were very few female photographers also at the time, and we can have this conversation about the history of women in terms of the history of photography. But some of these images have never been seen before. I love this photo. Out of the troubles. I think that's also something that many photographers were struggling with, you know. What about the norm? What about things outside of the violence? What about the life, daily life? And in fact, Luke Gibbons, in your book, Joyce's Ghost, you talk about Georges Perec, l'infranormal. So the banal, but beyond the banal, those things that really, could we please stop looking to the extraordinary and norm, in fact, look into things that really, anyway, this photo somehow I love because it's about a scene and a happy scene, no less, and I love it. Rosalind Fox Aleman might be the most famous of all these photographers in the sense that she's been exhibited very much and published very much, especially in America. But her work in Ireland was not so well known. I got a chance to write an essay for the Irish Museum of Modern Art a few years ago on the collection of David Crone. And this was included in it, and I thought this was the most striking portrait because it brought to light so many elements of the Troubles, including the economic nature of the Troubles, I mean, in terms of economics and social class. And this child, I mean, just artistically, the light and the structure of this portrait is just incredible. And I asked her, why this photograph, why were you in Ireland? And she said that she was particularly influenced by this book by Robert Coles, who was a child psychiatrist and psychologist, children of crisis. And this is why she went to Ireland, to north and south, by the way, this is Belfast, and some are Belfast, some are Dublin, to look into the lives of children and how they cope with trauma and violence. So she's an American artist based in New York City, Rosalind Fox Aleman, celebrated for her portraits and for her connection to human suffering, ritual, survival, and struggle. She was really always drawn to social rights and humanist stories and issues, but always through portraiture and really close-up portraits in striking black and white. She first traveled to Ireland in '73, and she returned 3 times to make those portraits. This print is now on show at the Irish Museum of Modern Art, if anyone wants to see actual prints. It's beautiful. It's interesting, she would take several photos of one child, for instance. Following them, you can see that she's really looking deep. That's the last one in this presentation, Dana Tainan. So interestingly, Dana Tainan, in fact, is a fashion photographer. She was very young when she came to Ireland. She's based in LA, and she's now a movie maker and really drifted away from this moment in her life where she came to Ireland. But when I found her and contacted her to ask her about her work, she didn't even have images to share with me. I had to send her what I had found in the books, and she was incredible because she moved away from documentary, she moved away from anything social or political. She's now quite a renowned commercial and fashion photographer. And so right before she went to Ireland in the late 80s, early 90s, she did an internship with Annie Leibovitz, who's an American fashion photographer. And so you can sense that in that work, and that's what I also find interesting in all this group, is that they really are all coming with different talents and perspectives, look into, but also the children. I mean, Dana Tainan was really interested in the youth, so children and teenagers of Northern Ireland. And that's it for this one, and I hope you can see the projection, which is pretty much these photographs, but in the context of the show at the Gallery of Photography. But to conclude, I'd like to maybe continue the conversation about the role of the archive and how important it is that these women photographers would be included in the archive, the grand archive, meaning author, vernacular, all the archives. In fact, the show that Trish has curated is really about this sort of flip side, or I don't know if that's a flip side, but what we haven't seen, what the canons had sort of not remembered. And I'm actually, it happens to stay, I'm staying in front of the Garden of Remembrance near Parnell Square, and I think it's important that we re-include these photographers because we need to remember them as photographers, we need to remember their subjects, we need to remember the stories that they told. And my mission as a photography historian is to make sure that this issue of remembrance and representation and legacy be respected in the sense of artistry, but it's about politics, it's about society, it's about history and memory. And Derrida was talking about the archive. He would say the archive is not of the past, it's of the future, and really this is what we are talking about here. We are talking about how will these moments be remembered, and it's very important that men and women, and also, I mean, there's a Japanese photographer that I'm researching, Akihiko Okamura. That's another man, another perspective from a Japanese man, and I love the idea of the multiplicity of gazes upon one story, about one history, about a multiplicity of histories, because of course that's what we've also seen today. There are so many stories, and I know that Brian is going to continue this now, showing us his work. And I'll conclude with a word by Gilles Perez, who I'm very close with and did my master's thesis about. But he mentioned recently, all the attacks on the photographers. It's not new since the 70s and Susan Sontag, and looking at the pain of others, but he opposes to the pain of others and that sort of exploitation. He says there's a crime of indifference. And I think the crime of indifference is in fact something to remember, especially these days with Ukraine and all of that. The role of the photographer, where he's, photojournalist or documentary or artist, is fundamental in my view in recording history and then remembrance.
Okay, if we run straight to Brian, and then we'll have an opportunity to ask a few questions at the very end. Brian's our final speaker of today. He's a freelance camera person who's been working with the Northern Ireland media industry for the last 25 years. His primary vocation is news gathering and television programme making. He lives in Belfast. He has a MFA photography distinction from Ulster University, a BA Honours in Visual Communication, first class from Ulster as well, and has participated in the Gallery of Photography Ireland Artist in Resident programme in 2019, and his work is featured in shows and exhibitions across Ireland. So Brian.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm just going to hit play, and you can maybe, people who are unfamiliar with my work, you can give me 5 or 6 minutes, you can maybe watch. Afternoon. The work I produce is very much an individual pursuit. It both complements and complicates my thought process. It introduces other narratives. I tend to follow the story, but can be open to change as I progress. The camera, I suppose, is my passport, and like the work of many other artists, it is occasionally gifted for others to interpret. My name's Brian Newman. I'm an incidental photographer who's made a career within the broadcast media industry in Northern Ireland for the past 25 years. I'm one of the artists in residence at the Gallery of Photography, who, along with the Department of Foreign Affairs, has been supporting my body of work association. This focuses on Orangeism and parts of the landscape around the border counties of Ulster. The project was conceived in 2011 and all but concluded in 21. The gallery has encouraged and supported this work since 2016, when I completed my MFA at the University of Ulster. Elements of the work have been included in exhibitions by the gallery, including Reframing the Border and Field Notes from the Border, plus inclusion, most importantly, in the new National Gallery Archive collection. A trusted association complements the excellent 2006 Borderlines Research Archive project and subsequent publications from the gallery. Since completing association, my considerations and work have lent towards the evangelical and structural aspects of faith within congregations in Northern Ireland during the pandemic. Easy for me to say. Borderlines was, let me see. Among a number of the images were really at the end of that particular slideshow. What are photographic representations and cultural identities? Well, in relation to my work, I want to first begin with my cultural identity. As you would have guessed by my accent, I'm from the north and I live in one of the many suburbs of Belfast. I grew up in the Troubles and like many others, probably still come to terms with the quagmire of identity and the emotional tug of witnessing circumstances beyond my control. I consider my family to be lucky. Many others were not. Father was from working class background. He lived in the industrial landscape of North Belfast. He would have been very familiar with the landscape of Kenneth Branagh's latest movie, Belfast. I have a vague recollection of that, showing my age. Class identity was important. There was a strong trade union association within my father's extended family, which had affinities with the old Labour Party. My mother's side, my grandfather was a tenant farmer from Narrowwater, County Down. Post-partition, he moved to Belfast Shankle Road and worked in one of the many mills that built the wealth of Belfast. When I reflect on my grandmothers and great-grandmothers, who also worked in the mills, they all had profound hearing issues caused by their poor working conditions. Right, and according to The Clash in 1977, there was no Elvis, Beatles or the Rolling Stones, and as a teenager, I began to think so as well. The music emerging from New York and England was, for many northern teenagers, transformational. I began to question authority and found something that I could identify with. Without realising or fully understanding, punk's impact was a release valve that still defines myself and my boyhood friends. My interest in photography as an art-based subject developed from the work of Belfast artist Paul Seawright, and that thread of thought through the 80s and the 90s by a number of other contemporary photographers. Belfast published Source magazine and Photoworks North were in their infancy, and photography was becoming visually challenging and thoughtful. Subject matters may have been familiar, but their approach and resulting imagery found both detail and stretched narratives. Their work remains a contemporary depiction of culture in a moment, but which may alter with time. My small portfolio has focused on people in halls, churches, landscapes and place. This reflects my interests in the people that affect me and who I'm identified with. despite having very little direct association with them. Both the gallery and the pages of a photo book can allow viewers to have the time and space to consider works which they may find alien and unfamiliar. We may just find the opportunity to create within this medium a greater understanding of difference and allow for a more considered, measured, rational discourse. And sure, that place and time is the very essence that helps us define art. Okay, thank you very much.
And very much speaks to kind of a part of life in Northern Ireland that isn't as well observed. You've been able to capture it. It's these liminal spaces, these hidden spaces, kind of the gaps and silences of culture, which aren't as widely understood, and it's so powerful for all of that. So open to the floor. Some very good presentations there. So are there any questions anybody would like to ask? First off, back there, and then.
There's two questions. One was to the previous speaker who was online. Is she still online? Hannah, is it?
She may not be because we were late starting and she
All right.
had to go.
Okay. So then
And
the
I think we can understand why.
The second question is to Brian Newman. It's about incidental photography. Do you think that people are more curious looking at the sort of photographs that you showed us there to make us look for meaning?
Well, the incidental thing is more to do with my interest in fine art photography or photography. The incidental nature of it is I work every day within, well, certainly in the past 15 years, certainly every day of collecting news. You would have seen my imagery, but it would have been at 25 frames a second on news programs and documentaries. So the incidental thing is, I suppose it's me clawing back. I do this as a self-interest, and the people giving me titles and things like that, I'm awkward with. So the incidental, it gives me there's an amateurish part of me and there's a professional part of me. I couldn't have made photography without my profession, and the amateur thing is my own being just inquisitiveness really. I'm searching for answers. I'm interested in the subject matter, and that to me a name is just kind of, I feel, defines me more than a professional photographer or an art photographer. I consider myself lucky to be in the profession I'm in. I've probably experienced a lot more than most. So it's maybe more putting more back. That sounds a little patronising, but I've been in life, I haven't really. There's a lot of people have suffered. There's a lot of suffering out there, and I could leave those things, but I want to develop my own work. Does that any sort of give you any sort of inkling into who I am and why I'm an incidental photographer?
I'm just curious then, are you curious what other people think of those images that are not sort of mainstream images, if you like? Are you curious what people really like, the things you see in the field, like the trees, the different?
Well, I'm just pushing the boundaries of photography.
Well, I'm kind of, I suppose I'm trying to understand, is it just for fine art, or are you curious what people get from that?
Oh, I'm very curious. And once the body of work's finished, I see it as a body of work. That for me, that's it. I hopefully, if the work's worthy of it, I'm interested in what other people think of it.
You are interested? Is that what you said? Sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Oh yes, I am. Very interested.
Okay, and how do you find out then what a lot of people think?
I don't know, it's not published yet.
Okay.
Work in progress.
Thank
Let's see where it takes us.
Yeah.
In the front here.
Hello, hello. Thank you, everyone. I just want to say thank you so much for the amazing discussions. There was some really powerful stuff there. I just wanted to say really quickly, thank you to Sinead. I liked what she was saying about the archives, 'cause I never really thought about it. And also the last thing that Pauline said in terms of like recording history. So then basically, it's like kind of along those lines, my questions. And so basically, I wanted to say that like in the age of like inclusion and PC culture, how do we make it so that way everything's inclusive while at the same time having like respect people's individual movements. And then the other thing I wanted to say was about the photographers that you were showing. They were really interesting. But the thing I was thinking about was in terms of like modern times, how would that play out? So like especially with like social media, that was my other thing, is that with social media, how is it that like we can create a new archive, or how is it that the archive is I guess respected? And that was pretty much it.
Right. That's more of a statement. Ask me, you were interested in what?
And the power of archiving, like in terms of like with social media, how does that play out? And then also I was just also asking in terms of like also, oh sorry.
You're okay. The archive thing is the most important. Camera is not. It's not a time machine. This is contemporary. It's based around from 2011 to 2021. Is it worthy of archive? That's not up to me. As a photographer, I have to just carry on and, the best of my ability, try to finish a body of work. It's up to others to see if it's worthy or not, and that may not happen. It can take decades. The most interesting part of the medium for me is looking back at it. I can look back 10 years, the start of it, and I reflect through the years. I don't necessarily have to look at the imagery anymore, but it opens your mind to other subjects, other narratives, well beyond the confines of Ireland. So whether it's valuable or not as an archive, it isn't up to me. But as a photographer, you're encouraged. I'm encouraged. I want to be creative. That's the process that gets me motivated. And if it's seen as worthy, then that's all the better.
Can I speak for that, about the fact that it's important in the history, that your work, that Brian's work is very important for many reasons. One is that it's a gap in representation. You were saying we haven't seen much of, and all of the foreign photographers that I showed in my PowerPoint, for instance, all pretty much focused on the nationalist side. There was always that narrative, of course, and the Marxist also at the time, Marxist narrative of the colonization. Colonization was really the narrative. And I think what's very important today, and what I think we should all celebrate, frankly, in the past maybe 5 years, with the advance of, and here I'm not talking about social media, I'm really talking about archives, and recovering archives and looking in archives is going hand in hand with work that's contemporary work that's filling the gaps in representation for today. And I think this is incredibly important. And of course, I think the fact that you're here and that your work, and that you're working on that book, of course, means that your work is incredibly important. And I think there are two things also to look at, because it's about art and it's about society and it's about representation. And I think that's what photography, that kind of photography, which is at the same time fine arts and documentary, it's hard to judge, of course. It's very subjective. Somebody's going to like your work, somebody's not going to like your work as plastic, as one image. Oh, it's a good image, it's a bad image. That's so subjective, you wouldn't even try to begin to judge an image like this, because nobody's going to agree. It's like a movie. But the importance and the relevance of the body of work within the history of photography and within the history of Ireland and Northern Ireland, I think there's no doubt that it's incredibly important.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I just want to also say one quick thing that I didn't mention though, is that the fact that like looking at like the images of the kids, like if you show the images of the kids, sorry. So in terms of talking about the archives, that's one of the things I wanted to mention, just that my handwriting's a bit sloppy. So basically it's like we're looking at the images and all these different photographers and the images are powerful. And there was even one photographer you said who kind of forgot about the images, which is also interesting to look at. But then like going back to modern times, like if you're photographing protests or if you're photographing a lot of stuff, like you need permission for everything. And then on top of that, like if you're using an image of a child, normally you need some sort of like parents' permission or someone else's permission. So then if you're trying to archive that thing and then like 20 or 30 years from now, which we don't know what it's gonna look like, but still it's like, what's gonna happen to that if you don't have the kids' contact and then like they're using it for a museum or something. I know something like that happened to, I think, Avedon or something like that once.
It happened to Magnum Photos. I was working there at the time. It was a total nightmare because not only was there a problem of the right of who is being represented, but also the keywords that go with those photographs. How do you describe the photographs? It's a big, big issue. It's still ongoing for archives, and I'm sure that Joy has the same issues also. I mean, how do you caption an archive? How do you make sure that a child photo is not going to be used inappropriately on the web? You know, all these very big questions that partake to photography and to photographers. The sadness being what this gentleman talked about before is that where does the freedom of the photographer stops, you know, and where does the freedom of the subject ends? And all of these very, very complicated issues. We had a huge month-long, when I was at Magnum, we did that seminar online with COVID called Beyond Magnum, which was all about representation and archives and the future of photography. And this is the central issue. Who is being represented and how and in what context and what was the original context and where is the image ending up now on the web of all places? You know, when it was in a box at Magnum Photos and a journalist would come and say, I'm interested in children in Thailand, you know, and to write an issue about that issue of children being forced to prostitution in Thailand in the 80s or 90s, it would be a journalist or probably not a curator at the time, but probably someone, an editor or a journalist coming to do a story about this. Someone, an archivist at Magnum, would hand him a box, would have checked the credentials of that person, hand him a box of, say, 10 prints that could be of interest for the story, to illustrate the story or to write about. Today, you Google that, exactly that same theme, and you end up seeing horrors, for one, because you end up seeing pornographic images that you were not looking for, and it becomes a real problem. So there are people who are here to make sure, you know, for at Magnum, for instance, Magnum Photos, you have a whole team of archives, of digital archives, who are now troubleshooting all the problems with the keywording, you know, erasing some keywords are now problematic that weren't problematic 10 years ago. And it's also the time, it's always the problem of when is the point of consideration of the image, you know, and who is looking at them. All that to say that these are current issues that are really important and that are being dealt with by the professionals, photographers, as well as people working for photographers, people working in for newspapers, editorial. It's a big issue. Of course, this is all through more so than for artists, I would say, really for editorial and agents, it's becoming really, it's been one of the nightmares of the past, I would say, 3 years.
Thank you.
A question for Pauline. Thank you so much for your presentation. Just as regards the artists archiving, you know, you're involved with the Catherine Leroy Foundation and also with the Saul Leiter Foundation. How does that work? Is that the way forward for artists to be safeguarding their archive?
It's the lucky way, you know. I mean, many photographers, in fact, don't have a team to work on their archive. The best way is to start when you're alive, always. Cartier-Bresson set up the Cartier-Bresson Foundation when he was still with us and with his wife, Martine Franck, and they had the means to set up a foundation. Cost a fortune in France, certainly less so in America, to set up a foundation. The Catherine Leroy Fund was made without money, but by people like Robert Pledge and Fred Richin and Dominique Deschavannes, who had worked with her, but she died very poor, very destitute, very much alone. And so that's two, and so later was yet another story. So there is no one way, but it's the lucky way is to have an archive, because when you have an archive, as an individual photographer, you know that your legacy is going to be assured, that people are going to be able to visit the archive, or certain people. Ideally, there is an online platform that makes it more accessible, more widely accessible, which is the case of Magnum Photos, for instance, which is a collective, and that's been digitized. But yes, that's the ideal scenario, to have the means to let the work be known, because otherwise, if you don't have the archive, if you don't have that representation, I mean, this is really all about representation also, then your work can easily disappear. Some of these women, many of these women, in fact, have no means to archive their work, and will spend, they don't have the means in terms of time and in terms of money, and that goes with many male photographers as well. But this money is always the key issue in all of these things, as we know. And so it's very important for photographers, for sure, to think about, at least to have a structure in there, I would say, just out of experience, and I work for the Robert Capa archive as well, to have a way to structure your archive. You know, maybe my father is an amateur photographer also, and I've helped him with organizing, you know, scanning, making sure that your negatives are digitized, for instance, that it's not going to be yet another huge mountain of a work for someone who's going to come after you. So to have a structure in the archive makes it more accessible for people like Joy to then come and digitize and share and make accessible with a wider public. Because in the end, what matters, for most photographers, not Leiter was different. I think Leiter he was just taking photos for the pleasure of taking photos. He didn't think much beyond that. But I think for many people who are photographers who are talking about history, society, and politics, the work is to be shared. It's not to be kept in the dark.
Okay, question here.
Yeah, in relation to what Pauline was saying about archiving, we internationally would be regarded as a very small agency. In Ireland, we would be a fairly large agency. We have about 500,000 images on archive. One of the problems is to archive them and keyword them properly is an ongoing process. And to have the finance to do that to the standard that's required is almost impossible.
Yeah.
So my first thing is, in case there's anybody in this room who has money to donate for archiving, we will happily accept it. Okay? Well, my other question is this, and it probably applies to the organisers more than anybody up there. We were talking about history all day, and since we started this morning, history has been happening. And photojournalists all across the city have been going out recording it. And some of the images in their cameras, which are now digital and not analog, will have got pictures that in 5 years' time, or maybe even 2 years' time, will be regarded as historic. But out of 12 speakers here, we don't have actually, with respect to Brian, we don't have one working professional photojournalist that I'm aware of. And I wonder what is the problem about that? Because we can't go speaking about history and going back to Michael Collins and all the fantastic images that were taken back then, and ignore the working photographers who go out every day as photojournalists, and who need to be represented properly at conferences like this. And it really is, in my opinion, quite disgraceful that they're overlooked to this extent. And I do want to say, in finishing, that the exhibition is a fantastic exhibition. I admire all the people who have images in it, who have images going back to the 80s and the 70s, etc. Some beautiful images. But you need to support and understand and please respect the photographers who are going out today to do everyday images, some dangerous, some easy, some where their lives are being threatened, some where they are creating artistic images out of nothing. And please do consider them in future. Thank you.
How much time do we have?
Can I just say something? Is that Donna de Cesare was going to be here if she could have, but she was still teaching, but she will be one speaking, I think in May.
One more question. But I think everybody would agree the issue of representation is fundamental. Whether it be too often, so many conferences, they forget women Perhaps this conference hasn't included enough photographers. That's always something, I think, any time you're trying to set up a conference can be very challenging, but is something we should always question ourselves, because much of our conversation today has been about the ethics of how we go about and consider these issues. One last question. If there's not, will I just try and just sum things up? First of all, I'd like to thank everybody for their contribution today. It's been absolutely fascinating, and I think such a broad range of perspectives. And I do think it is come together, and it is held together as a totality. As ever, we all bring our own perspectives to anything we engage with. And I suppose from my particular sort of perspective over recent years, I've been looking at the ethics of memory. So it was interesting to hear at the start of the conference talk about Susan Sontag and some of her thinking, because particularly her son David Reef has gone on to write quite a bit about the ethics of memory, and particularly in relation to commemoration. And when we think about the past, and I think this very much came through when William was talking about the work of the likes of the Ulster Museum, the whole idea of multi-perspectivity is so important. Recognising that there are many different perspectives out there, and we should always be challenging ourselves in relation to sort of the binary sort of approach of the singular sort of interpretations that there might be. We need to bring in much more multiple perspectives, and recognising that there are a wide variety of ways of looking at any of these issues. That brings into sort of play the whole idea of gaps and silences, and I mean, again, like Brian talking about, you know, the border communities, but also sort of marginal sort of communities. They may not be marginal to their own lives. I know for myself recently, a few months back, looking at a project in Tyrone and going into an Orange Hall and into a particular community there, it felt very different to me. It felt fundamentally different to me, to the Northern Ireland that I knew. But it's a very important part of it all. And how do we give sight to those places, and how do we keep those different communities in our mind when we do think about issues of identity, and particularly the past. Other issues, you know, I think in relation to this, it's about recognising, while that there are many narratives out there, that, you know, we should not be privileging one narrative over another, and particularly through the past has been so much about privileging particular narratives and not recognising some of those wider stories that are there. And that's why it was particularly interesting, I think, Pauline's work, and particularly in relation to bringing out those female photographers, and just the different sort of the different sort of look that they brought it all. That is so particularly profound and important indeed. The start of the day, sort of Tommy's session, Fergal started off talking about, I suppose, the ethics of all of this, the politics of photography, asking us those questions about our privilege, and you know, who's taking the photograph, what are they taking the photograph for, and what does that mean? And, you know, recognition, particularly as someone who's looked at memory and how memory changes over time, the meaning of photography changes as well, and that whole sort of polyvalent approach, and the limitations of what we see, and that idea of looking at a photograph as a cross-section of a second in time, and standing for it and representing it. So, you know, it was then interesting to look at from Joy at the Public Records Office of Northern Ireland, and her presentation of 19th century photographer. And the one thing that really struck me as I was watching that, and I was thinking of what his privilege was, and then to immediately go to Mark Seeley's presentation on the whole sort of decolonisation. I'm currently reading Catherine Elkin's book, Legacy of Violence, which is a deconstruction of the British Empire and a really challenging sort of perspective on it. And sort of Mark is doing that work from a photographic perspective. But how we think about the implications, how implicated we become when we engage in some of this material. There's some interesting work that is being done in academic circles about implication and our role within all of that. He mentioned Levinas and the idea of taking responsibility for the other. I mean, again, that links into the ideas of people like Hannah Arendt. How can you put yourself in the shoes of the other? And how important all of that is whenever we sort of think and consider these things. We moved on to, in the afternoon, Mark's session, and that point, which I referred to earlier about commemoration, is much about the present as it is about the past. In fact, that's the anthropologist post. It is all about the present. It is not about the past. So whenever we saw Charlie Flanagan getting into trouble over the RIC last year, he really should have known better. But politicians can't help themselves, and they think they're talking about history, but no. And anyway, the Irish Times was filled for the next couple of weeks of articles and this, that, and t'other, and the debate about how we think about the past was enriched by that discourse, ultimately, indeed. And the point... Sorry. Right. It looks much more glamorous when you're down here when it says international call and you realise actually it's probably just the wife at home calling me. So photos are more than sort of visual backdrops. Absolutely, they're so embodied in so much. Sinead's point about the photo being the direct quote and the photographer being the context. We've got to understand an awful lot more. We've got to look deeply. Whenever we look at a photograph, it's not just looking at that and simply not thinking sort of deeper and wider on that. And what it takes to get things as right as we can, the amount of effort and research that goes in is so fundamentally important. I've touched on what William was talking about in terms of national museums. And then again, I think the work National Museums in Northern Ireland has been very, very difficult and very challenging. How do you tell all these wide stories to a divided society that really wants to see its own story reflected well? But the point he made was that actually the key thing is it's not about it's actually about inclusion as opposed to exclusion. If you're excluded, that's where the problem lies. When you include these other voices, actually people feel represented, and one would have thought that there would have been a lot more challenge to the National Museum of Northern Ireland about a lot of its exhibitions, but there hasn't been because they've made a conscious effort of including all of those different voices, and the fundamental finishing point that William made about talking is the key to managing conflict. It's all about conversation. It is all about a term, one particular academic that was involved in National Museum's work looked at the whole idea of agonism and agonistic sort of memory, this idea of we've got to recognise there's a lot of different voices. Even in this room, there's a lot of different people coming from very different perspectives. We need to be open to perspectives which challenge ours and accept that. That's fundamentally important, and some of our public spaces enable us to do that. Orla Fitzpatrick, the whole on quirk and how the caution we need to have in our heads whenever we're looking at sort of historic photographs, and we went on to hear about how those photographs, particularly from Erica, how they could be sort of misused, depending on the perspective of individuals who would, what they would bring to that. And Pauline, again, just bringing in the voices of those women photographers, not the voices, the images, the thoughts in their head at that time. You know, that again, we've got to see, bring that multi-perspectivity. That's where we get a much better, still only a partial, but a much better understanding of what society was like when we're looking at historic photography. You know, and even the difference the eye of a war photographer brings the eye of a political activist, and the different things that people can focus on. And but fundamentally, it should never be about simply the news value of a photograph. You know, that in itself is kind of lost, and we kind of look to the newspapers first. But you know, what are they? Maybe some of the most interesting photographs would be the other photographs that they didn't include. And just finally, Brian and you know, his very, very personal and sort of very, very profound representation of you know, a community that has suffered so much, and has been forgotten. And that's the thing about it, is all about the future. We can't, you know, the future has got to be an inclusive one, and it can't be about forgetting communities and leaving out particular communities, and how do we go about and do that. And by giving voice to them is one of the strongest ways of achieving it. Anyway, that's my quick run through of the day. So thank you very much indeed. And does somebody do you want to?
I would just close out, but thank you very much, Paul, for your considered remarks. We're very interested to hear Eamon's comments. Eamon's work from Rolling News is featured in our exhibition, as is the work of the Irish Times photographer. This event, Eamon, just to give you context on that, this was originally planned for our history show for January, which was on in Dublin Castle, and it's situating photography within wider visual culture. So I don't think that this is the place for that very valid conversation to take place. I think we should talk about maybe organise something during the run of the protest show. Because I think, well, yeah, and that's grand, and it's good to have different opinions, you know. I mean,
no, I say it would be interesting to go back in some of the pictures that you have in exhibition, going back to the early 70s, and talk to the photographers who will be there, and say, how did you deal with the ethics of the situation?
And I think the place for that is within the context of that show.
That's true.
Yeah.
Another point to remember is, when photographers go out today and they take a picture and it appears in the Irish Times, you're forgetting the other images that were not newspaper friendly, that they took on that day and sent in hoping that they would be used, but they weren't.
Yeah. Yeah, no, sure. This is actually an area of, if you talk to, we've been having these conversations with Eric Luke and Derek Spears, you know, this is something that's a real area, so let's revisit that in the context of our current show that's on there. So listen, it just remains for me to thank our wonderful chairs and our fantastic contributors. Thank you very much. On behalf of Tanya, myself, and I would just like to thank our own teams that have worked so hard behind the scenes, our technical team here in Dublin Castle, and Miles Campbell, on behalf of OPW, to say that from his COVID isolation, he said he's really enjoyed listening to the contributions today, and he found it really fascinating. So thanks again to our funders, Department of Foreign Affairs, to the OPW, to the Arts Council, to Dublin City Council, and to Creative Scenes. And thanks very much for coming. If you'd like to go to the gallery in Meeting House Square, there'll be a nice cold glass of something, and you can come and see our protest show, and Eamon will finish off with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul.
Of course. No, I'm so happy. I will be in touch.